Hi and welcome to another video on how to create a game like Clash of Clans. So in the previous videos we placed a building on the grid and create a cancel button and also a confirm button, and in this video we're gonna set the event of this confirm button here. If you remember, we created a method in our UI building. Let's check this out. Here it is, confirm build. So right now it's not being referenced from anywhere, so I'm just going to cut the content of this and remove this method. Instead, I'm going to go to my UI build, so whenever this confirm button gets clicked, the first thing I check to see if our building.instance is not equals to null. And then let's paste the values that we copied. I'm gonna create a packet. Let me add the namespace. So that is the namespace. Let's go back. So here the request type is build. We're also sending a device ID, and the third parameter I'm just going to send building.instance.id. If you remember, we created a string in our building script to identify each building. So our work is done here. Now let's go to my database. Let me start the database service first. And let me open the database admin page. So my database is open now. I am going to start my server project. So here in terminal script, in the receive packet, if we receive type 3, which is our build quest, the first thing we're gonna get is a string, which is the device. The second one also is going to be a string, which is our building ID. Let's say read string, and then we call a function in our database, place building, and we're gonna pass this data. Let's go to this place building function. Go to definition, and here instead of int I'm gonna pass a string. So before we continue with our database, let me actually remove these two demo methods. So that's that. I'm also going to collapse that. So before we proceed, I'm gonna open my scripts folder. Here in the client, I'm gonna create a public string and name it device. I'm also going to create an integer and name it account. And here when this client gets disconnected, let me find the disconnect function. I am going to set the device to nothing. Also, I am going to set the account to 0. And now let's go to the terminal. Here in the receive string, as you can see, whenever a player gets connected, the authenticate player is going to be the first function that they call. So let's go to definition, and here in the authenticate player, whenever a player gets authenticated, we're just gonna say server.client, and we have an ID for our client. It's this ID that has been passed to us, so I'm gonna say ID. It is a dictionary, this client. We're gonna access that, and we're gonna set the device, the variable we just created, to this device, that player that has passed to us. We're also going to say server.clients. We're gonna access the dictionary one more time, and the dictionary of index ID dot account is going to be this account ID. Of course, we need to change the type of this account in our client to long. We chose integer, but long is the correct value type. So let's go back to the database. Basically, we no longer need the device. We got the account ID and saved it when player got authenticated. So we have access to this account ID, so we can use that from now on. Now let's go to the data and create a class, name it building. The first thing obviously is going to be the ID of our building. The second one is going to be an integer, and it's going to be the level of our building. We also need a database ID for this building, so we're gonna say long database ID. So let's go to the database and create a method. Let me copy this sync player data, and I'm gonna use this as a template to create a method called getBuilding. So the return type is going to be data.building, and it takes an account ID, which is going to be of type long, and a string, which is going to be the building ID. This is also going to be building, same thing here, and it's going to be select ID level from buildings, where let's say code, we're gonna name that string, which is the ID code in our database, equals to ID. So here we say data.database ID equals to ID, and up here the first thing we say data.ID equals to this ID that has been passed, and here we say level equals to level. The other two we don't need. So this way we can get a single building. We could also get an array of building. Let's actually copy this and create a method which is going to get all the buildings from an account. So we're not gonna pass any ID. It's just gonna get all the buildings for this account. But before we go any further, let's create it. Let's go to the database, open the database we've created. And here I'm just gonna create another table, name it buildings. The first one is going to be ID. The second one is going to be account ID. This is gonna be the ID of the owner of this building. The third one is going to be level. And this one, let's say it's going to be code. And let's actually bring the level here and bring the account ID here. This is going to be global ID. So this is going to be the global ID, the string that we created that is going to identify this building. Level is going to be an integer. The default value for this is going to be 1. Account is also going to be integer. This one is also going to be integer, but the first one is going to be a primary auto increasement. So we're going to check that, and let's create this table. And let me just copy this global ID. Let's go back to the database, and instead of code, I'm just gonna say global ID. Before this global ID, I'm gonna say account ID equals to this, and this is going to be 0, this is going to be 1. The 0, let's say account, and global ID equals to 1, which is this one. So that's for our single building. Let's go to a list building. So instead of data building, I'm just gonna say a list of buildings. So to use list, we need to say using system collections generic. Let's do that. So let's go back, and let me just copy this and paste it here and here. I'm just gonna remove that line, and also this task is going to be list of data building. So we're gonna say select ID level from buildings, where account ID equals to this, and this is going to be our account. And now for each value that it finds, we're gonna create a data.building, and I'm gonna name it building equals to new building. So building.database ID and level are going to be get like this, and here the data, we're gonna say data.add building. This way we can get a list of buildings. And let's go up here in the sync player data. We're sending a string back to the client. I think it's better if we just send a packet instead. So I'm gonna create a new packet. And instead of string data equals to this, I'm just gonna say packet.write, and it's going to write the contents to our packet, and it's going to send the packet to our client. But we don't need to pass an ID like this. Here we're just gonna say, if you remember, we created a contract with ourselves. The first parameter of each packet is going to be the ID of that packet. So we're gonna say write to, and I'm just gonna remove that. And here let's create a list of buildings. And we're gonna say await get buildings async. So here let me create a long. If you remember, the account ID of each client was saved in the server.client, and of course the client ID dot account. So we're just gonna pass that account ID. So let's actually cut these buildings and bring it up here, and let's go to our data script, and here in the building I'm just going to create a public list of buildings, and it's going to be called buildings. And in the database I'm just gonna say player dot buildings equals to buildings. And to handle it in the client side, let's go to the player, and here we need to add in event for receiving packets. I'm just gonna copy this received string. Let's actually just rename this received string because we don't need it. I'm just gonna name it received packet, and it's going to be packet. And here I'm just gonna copy the name, paste it here, and this is going to be on packet received. So here the first item of the packet is going to be an integer, which is going to be the ID of this packet equals to packet.readInteger, and the second one is going to be player class, which is a string, and it's going to be packet.readString. And we're just gonna deserialize the player class. Of course, let's not to forget to go to the server, and here I'm just gonna copy this class, the player class and the buildings class, and go back to the client. Here we also have a class named data, paste it here instead. These two classes need to be exactly like each other, so I'm gonna name the namespace to remove the errors. Let's go back to the server. We also need another table in our database. Let's actually create it and name it server buildings. So let's create that. The first one is ID. The second one is global ID. This is level. This is required gold. And the ID is going to be auto increasement. Of course, we need two more columns. For now, let's just create that. So let's add two more columns. This is going to be required elixir. And let's actually set the default value to 0. This is going to be required gems. And save this. I'm also going to change this required gold and set the default type to 0. And let's go to the insert. I'm just gonna insert a default value to my server buildings. The ID is going to be generated automatically. I'm gonna leave that. Global ID equals to gold mine. If you remember, we set this on our prefab. Of course, we need to go and change the value type. Let's go back to the structure. And here in the global ID, I'm gonna change that. Change the value type to, and let's choose the length of 50. I'm just gonna save that. I'm also going to go to the buildings table and change the global ID type in there as well. Now let's go back to the server buildings, go to the insert. The global ID is going to be gold mine level 1. And let's say we need 500 elixirs to build gold mine level 1. Click go and create record. And here in the browser you'll see that the gold mine level 1 requires 0 gold, 500 elixirs and 0 amount of gems. So let's go back to our server. Let's go to the data and create a server building as well. So I'm just gonna copy this building and name it server building. The server building has an ID, has a level, database ID. It also has 3 more values which all are integers. So it has required golds, elixirs and gems. And let's go to the database. Here I'm just going to copy this get building async. And I am just going to paste it here. Let me actually collapse the other methods, make it look better. And this is going to be get server building async. It doesn't have an account, so it's just gonna pass an ID. And we also need to pass the level, of course. So we're gonna say int level. So we say select ID, required gold, required elixirs and gems. So get those values from server buildings where global ID equals to 0, and because it's a string we're gonna add the single quotation, and of course level is equals to 1, and we're gonna remove those because it's an integer. The first one is going to be ID, the second one is going to be level. So that's going to select that for us, and instead of data building it's going to be data server building. Let's change all the references to server building, and let me just copy this from here and paste it 3 times. Required gold, required elixir and required gems. I'm just gonna copy it from here, the name of the columns. And level, we can just get it from the value that has been passed from here, and ID is going to be set from here. Let's go back to place building. Actually, let's rename this to get player data. So we have a function that is going to get the player data for us. So that's that. Whenever we want to place a building, first we're gonna get the player data, and let me copy this. The second thing, we need to get the building, which is the server building. So we're gonna say get server building async. So we need to pass an ID, which is going to be the building ID, and the level, which is going to be 1. And here we say if player dot gold greater and equal than building dot require gold, and player dot elixir is greater or equal than building dot require elixir, and the same thing for the gems. So in this case, we have enough resources to build the building for the player, but that's not good enough. we also need to check if the place is available on the grid. Of course, we check that on the client side, but we never trust the client. We always check everything on the server. So to do that, we get the list of all the buildings that this player has. So just like here, we're gonna use that account ID. Now here, let's create a boolean and name it can place building, and we set the value to true. Well, actually, let's create a method for it, just like the method we created on the client side. Let's go to the client, the build grid, and here this is the function that is going to check to see if the place is available. I'm just gonna copy it and paste it, let's say here for now. Of course, for this building in our database, we need to create 4 more values. The first one is going to be an integer called x. The second one also going to be an integer called y. The other one is going to be columns. And the last one is going to be rows. And here the server building is also going to have 2 values. It doesn't need x and y, but it needs columns and rows. So we're gonna add that to that, and let's go to the database. In the structure of our server building, I'm just gonna create 2 more columns. I'm gonna name it columns count as defined. I'm gonna set it to 1, and this is going to be rows count, and as defined I'm also going to set this to 1. Let's save this. Let's go to the buildings and add the necessary columns as well. Here in the structure, I am going to add 4 columns. This is going to be x position, this is going to be y position, this is going to be columns count, and the last one is going to be rows count. So let's save that, and we also need to go to the server and copy these values and paste it in our client data to match both classes. And here in the database, we also need to return those values as well. So here in the server building, we need to get those columns count and rows count. So let me just copy this, paste it here and here, columns and rows. And I'm just gonna say columns count and rows count. The same thing here in the building. And I'm just gonna add the necessary fields. Let me just copy it from there. 2 for x and y, 2 for rows and columns. X position and y position. And we need to do a similar thing in our get buildings, which is going to get a collection of buildings. And let's just use these values and paste them here. And instead of data, I'm just gonna say building, building, and building. And here also I'm just gonna say building dot id equals to reader dot global id. And here we also need to get the global ID. So now we're finished here. Let's go back to our can place building method. Let me copy all the contents of this and paste it here instead. And let me just remove that. So let's hard code a bunch of things temporarily, of course. And here in the place building, we're gonna get a device building ID, and we also need an int which indicates x, and another int indicates y. We don't pass these because the x and y, we're gonna use this x and y that clients are going to send us. This is also going to be the same x and the same y, and here we know that the number of the columns in our grid is 45 and the rows are 45 as well. Of course this is hard coded here, but I don't have any intention to changing the grid size. If you change the grid size, make sure these number matches with the grid size you have on the client. So here can place building equals to false. And now here we're gonna add an else. We're gonna loop through this buildings array we have, which is a list of the buildings that the player has. We don't need to check if this building is the same building in this list, so let me just remove that. Unfortunately, as you can see, Rect belongs to Unity Engine and we don't have access to it in our server. So for now, I'm just gonna comment this. We're gonna get back here. We're just assuming the tile is available. So finally here we're saying if can place building, then we're gonna create a method for it. Let's just use this one up here, authenticate player async. I'm just gonna copy this and let's collapse the methods that we don't want. I'm just gonna paste it somewhere here. And this is going to be place building async. It takes an account ID and a data.server building. And it's gonna return a long, which is the ID of that building in the database. So let's go here. We have an insert here, but before we do that, I'm just going to create a query here saying update accounts set gold equals to gold minus first parameter elixir equals to elixir minus second parameter, and of course the same thing for gems. And we're gonna say where ID equals to our fourth parameter. So the first one is going to be building.required gold, building.require elixir and gems. And the last one is going to be account ID. Of course, the account ID is going to be a long, so we need to remove these signs around the parameter, and that is going to update the account for us. Let me just clear that, and instead of that, I'm just gonna say using SQL command, execute that command for me over there, and let me cut this. And paste it here. So at the end, it's going to return a building ID for me. So let's create a long ID equals to 0. And at the end, just return this ID for me. Insert into buildings. And we also need to pass a couple of more integers, which are going to be x and y. So insert into buildings, global ID, account ID, x position, y position, columns count, and rows count. So it takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parameters. The first one is in a string. The rest are integers. So that's 1, this is 2, and let's say this is going to be 3 and 4 5 6. That's our global ID. We have the account ID, let's say X and Y, and of course the building dot columns and the building dot rows. So here we go, and we're just gonna execute that, and of course the ID equals to command last insert ID, and we're gonna return that ID. And let's go up here, and we're just gonna say building ID equals to await place building async. We're gonna pass the account ID, building X and Y, and at the start of our place building function we create a packet which is the response of our server. We're gonna write response number 3 for now. We're gonna need to change that value and create an enum for them, but for now leave it like that. And here we're saying sender does send TCP. I'm gonna pass the client ID and of course the packet. So that is going to send the packet. So here, if we don't have enough resources, I'm just gonna create an else statement and say packet dot write, let's say 0. If it's 0, it means you don't have enough resources. Here let's say else, and let's write another value here. If the second parameter is 2, it means this place is already taken, and if the packet.write is 1, the value for the second parameter of the packet is 1, it means the building placed successfully. So that's just like that. Let's go back to the client, and here in the player received packet, we're gonna say in the case of 3, and when we break we're gonna say nth response equals to packet dot read integer, and I'm gonna switch between that response case 0, case 1 and 2. Debug.log, no resources, and let me copy this. In the event of 2 place taken, and this one indicates that the building has been placed successfully. So let me copy this and paste it, placed successfully. And of course, if you remember, we add a couple of more parameters to this place building. We add an X and Y. So let's go back to the client, and here in the build confirm, after we write the building ID, we also need to write the X and Y. So that's the current X, and let's write the current Y as well. And let's go back to the server. Let's see where this is getting called. Yes, it is in the terminal received packet. So let's create a couple of integers, and we're just gonna pass that X and Y. So let's start the server, and I'm going to start the client as well. So the resources value has been synced. Let's go to the shop and place the building. I'm gonna click confirm, and as you can see, place successfully has been called in my debug.log. And let's go and check out the database. I'm gonna go to the buildings. As you can see, a gold mine has been placed for the account ID of 0, which is the wrong number. This should be 1. The level by default is 1, and the position is 2525. So let's go and check out why this is 0. This shouldn't be 0. Let me stop the server and go back to the code here in the database. So we are calling this place building. Yes, we are passing the account ID, placing building, and here it is. This is why our account ID has been changed to 0. We need to remove that line and that should fix it. So the video got too long and I think this is enough for this video. In the next video we're gonna handle when this successful message appears, this building is going to be placed here, and also when the player starts the game, all the buildings is going to be loaded on our grid. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.